Welcome to the Wordy Pair Podcast, your go-to hub for all things writing, world building, and the occasional dive into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We're breaking down the barriers between you and your next great story. Whether you're a seasoned scribe or just scribbling your first sentences, we've got something for you. We'll be discussing everything from crafting compelling characters to dissecting the good, the bad, and the downright bizarre in the world of fiction. Okay, this script says you guys are eccentric. Isn't that just a 3-syllable word for weird? No offense. So, whether you're in need of inspiration, a good laugh, or just a couple of weirdos to keep you company on your writing journey, you're in the right place. Thanks for tuning in to the Wordy Pair Podcast.
Okay, well, welcome to episode... My goodness, is this episode 10 of the Wordy Pair Podcast?
No.
I
think we're on 11. I think we did 10.
Really? Also, it's worth noting that this is actually going to be episode 12 because one of the ones we recorded later on we ended up throwing at the start of the queue. So I didn't want to mess up this exchange too much, but this is episode 12, even though it was 11 when we recorded it. Fun times. You're right, we did. Okay, 11 it is.
Did we do 11? Wait, what's 10? What is 10?
10 is the one we recorded last week.
Okay, then...
Okay,
is that what we're titling it? The one we recorded last week? Can that be the title?
I forget what it is, but it could be.
Last week's can be the one we recorded last week, and then we'll title this one the one we recorded this week.
That makes perfect sense.
That should not be confusing at all. That should not be anywhere near as confusing as, say, hard magic systems or lit RPGs.
You're spoiling it. You're spoiling our topic.
I saw an opportunity for a segue, and I took it.
Like a Segway. Those things are valuable, because they're rare at this point.
Yeah, like a Segway. No handlebars for the very first... I don't know, there's a joke in there somewhere.
Somewhere, but it's alright. We don't need to tease it out today. So yeah, we're going to be talking about the recent, I guess we would call it trend, of making magic systems especially hard, and kind of talking about how the advantages and disadvantages of that versus some kind of a softer system, like something out of, say, Lord of the Rings, or maybe some earlier fantasy novels. The representative of hard magic that I kind of feel has a lot of influence right now in the current writing, writing world, is Brandon Sanderson, who is an extremely prolific author, and he writes good books, and we're not trying to dunk on him, necessarily, but there are some problems with making hard magic systems and making them fun to read, which we'll kind of get into. And there are, of course, also problems with having especially soft magic systems. So we both read... Well, so I read all of Mistborn, which I think was his first book in that series a while back, and I read another couple hundred pages of it this week. You've read a good chunk of it.
I've read... You've read all of it. I have read up to where I needed to read.
Yeah, pretty much. I gave you homework.
And also, I don't think that it was really a bad book. But,
no,
we'll get into what we think about.
I just think that the hard magic bits are a little bit overdone in some places, and there are some issues that come up with making a hard magic system that probably... I mean, he might even have fixed these issues in his later books. So, this was his first... I think this was his first novel that actually got professionally published. So, it's clearly it definitely has rough spots in it.
Oh, you mean his first personal novel, not like... Because didn't he... Was that before or after his Wheel of Time fixer-upper?
My assumption is that it had to be before, because that's how he got the job as the Jordan replacement.
Oh, from writing the Mistborn series?
From writing some... Either the Mistborn series or one that came slightly after it. I'm pretty sure Mistborn was his first professionally published book.
Oh, okay.
So anyway,
that makes it even better to know that this was his first book, because then it's like, I wonder if maybe he ever went back and read it and was like, how many times was I going to write the word push and pull?
And the answer is infinity.
So let's start off with just a few thoughts. before talking about the pros and cons of these things.
Well, we should probably do some definitions and then some thoughts and then get into it. Yeah, sure.
I'm going to let you take the definitions because up until you proposed this project, I had never thought of anything in terms of hard magic and soft magic. Like, I'd heard of hard sci-fi and sci-fi.
Well, hard sci-fi is pretty easy to understand what it is, and what hard magic is kind of the attempt to put a scientific framework around magic in literature. So, basically, the idea of hard magic is that the magic has very specific rules that it follows. They are consistent. They have, specific, certain things have specific uses. Certain things have specific things that they can't be used to do. Basically, it's a system of highly regimented rules for magic that differs greatly from, say, Tolkien, where you never really know exactly what magic can do. And it does things that sometimes solve problems, and it doesn't do other things that sometimes could have solved other problems. But you never know exactly why. And, soft magic is just like someone chanted some words in a language I don't understand, and something happens. And it's and the author may or may not have a really solid idea of what magic can and cannot do. And this, of course, causes its own series of problems. But anyway, that's kind of the definition of hard versus soft magic. Hard is regimented, has a very specific system with very clear rules. Soft is kind of fuzzy, kind of subtle about what it can and can't do. And both of these systems have, advantages and disadvantages. But those are my definitions. If you want to add anything, feel free.
Well, I don't have anything. I think that pretty much covers what I figured the idea would be behind it, because like I said, I had never even heard of the terms hard and soft magic before. To me, it was always just like, oh, there's magic in this story. And when people got too descriptive of how their magic system works, it's like, okay, buddy, you need to calm down there a little bit.
Sure.
I know that. Okay, so like, I can think of an example where like a good mix of the idea of hard magic, but with soft magic presentation.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I'm thinking of that wretched movie, The Covenant, where there wasn't really any definition of what magic could and couldn't do, but there was this hard rule that every time you used it, it was burning away some of your life.
Okay.
So that's like, I would have thought that like that was the difference between like complete fancifulness with magic and having a set of rules. But apparently some people like to create an entire universe of rules just for their magic system.
Yes.
So that they can...
And this is a trend that I've been noticing, is that Sanderson does this, and a lot of people who talk about fantasy also use Sanderson kind of as an example of this, and they also try to like do it. Like they're like, oh, I want to make a hard magic system for this. And so they end up, creating a giant framework of rules and, all of the pluses and minuses that come along with that.
Yeah, so I think a plus to that is it's the same. Like we had an episode where you and I talked about how you like to kind of plot things out, and I kind of just sit at a keyboard and write things as I go.
Yeah.
That would be a good example of like you sit down and you come up with your magic system, or you do your world building kind of thing off to the side. Maybe have a little notebook that has all your rules written down. But you don't need to present all those rules to the reader. You can actually create the hard system and then follow all of your rules, but present your story as if it's just fanciful magic. And the reader can know what's going on. Now, that's not to say that there's not a place for this hard magic concept, but I think it's very like... I think there's a lot of people who would look at it as, say, okay, so there's this entire genre of writing called lit RPG, which I didn't even understand what it was when I first started seeing it pop up in places. It's relatively new. Like I remember the first time I saw lit RPG under genre, I was like, oh boy, everyone's jumping to Netflix genres now. Because you know how Netflix will be like, action adventure series, mystery series, people who like pillows series.
Yeah.
It's just like these very specific genres that don't make any sense to use as genres, because that's what genre means as a generalization.
Right. Well, to be clear, in order to write hard magic, you don't need to necessarily present all of the rules to the reader. In fact, you're advised not to do so.
Right,
But,
that's what I'm saying, is you can have your notes.
Whether those rules exist or not is a different question.
Yeah. But like, I was reading Mistborn, and there was a point at which I was like, okay, well, what is Rudy talking about here? Because so far it's a pretty decent story, and I'm not really seeing where and then I got to the scene, and it was just like, and he burned this metal, and then he burned this metal, but then this metal he used to push against this metal. But he couldn't push too fast or pull too hard. And depending on when he was pulling or pushing, it was pulling wrong or pushing wrong. And he couldn't push too much in this direction, otherwise it would pull this other thing in this direction. And it's just, and then they were talking about pushing and pulling emotions, and I was like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, the words push, pull, and flare.
Like I started to feel like I was having a fever dream.
like some kind of literary seizure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is the major downfall of a hard magic system, is that you end up creating a vocabulary that turns into something that becomes overused in the story. And this is extremely obvious. This is extremely prevalent or prominent in Mistborn specifically. He comes up with this vocabulary. He has. So technically there are 10 metals, but really there are 10 metals, but really he's only referring to 8, and they're all paired up, and they all have certain abilities, and the pairs they push, one of the pair pushes and the other pair of the pair pulls, but they push and pull on different things, and there's some not contradictions, but there's some fuzziness in like what push and pull stands for, and it's like there's a bunch of rules in there, and like, in my opinion, it really hurts the writing in some places where every other word is burn, push, pull, flare, or the name of a metal.
Yeah, and I noticed that, like, I'm pretty sure parts of the story were being interrupted with these explanations that would otherwise have been, like, these really, really good descriptions of what's going on in characters' heads.
Yes.
Like the character early in the story that I didn't finish it, but I'm assuming she's a main character throughout the story. Vin?
Vim?
You're seeing a lot of her internal thoughts, and nobody quite has a grasp of who she is or what she's thinking at the time. And
right.
A lot of what she is thinking is that she doesn't trust anyone. And so you're getting this story in her head of, well, what is it these people all want from me? And I guess I'm going to have to help them because now I want to know what this power is that I have, so that she's trying to learn about her own power so that she can be independent of these people and not have to rely on anyone. And a lot of that was interrupted by these constant descriptions from other magic using characters about how their magic works. And she would ask them questions where they would explain to her. I remember one in particular just drove me absolutely nuts, where the guy that she's talking to says, "Oh yeah, well, I mean that's like pushing on someone's emotions, but in reality you're pulling on them." And I'm just like, "What?"
Oh yeah.
Okay, throw that confusion into the mix. Why not?
Well, I mean, it would have been better if he had just used, like, because he actually has a more detailed vocabulary, right? Where the push and pull only refer to iron and steel, and then he has like riot and for emotions, he has like riot, and then there's another word for it, soothe and riot, I think.
Yeah.
And so, like, it would have been way better if he hadn't tried to maintain that push-pull dichotomy on each pair of metals, and just said, no, there's just separate words for each of these, and they mean roughly opposite things, but they're not like, I'm not going to call everything a push and everything a pull. Yeah, I mean, the main issue is the limitation in the vocabulary to these short, nondescript, one-syllable words, and their repetition especially in action scenes, where you're supposed to be like taking attention on the things that are happening, but instead you're trying to, squirm your way through a haze of the words push and pull over and over again. It's one of the ways that hard magic can be done in a way that I think detracts from the storytelling.
I recently had a moment where I was creating words for magic in a story just so I could do a pun. Like I was calling a type of magic drut so that I could describe someone casting a spell but talking about them getting stuck in a drut.
Uh-huh.
And I went back and read it, and I wasn't even coming up with like a hard system of anything. I was just coming up with a few random words to describe different types.
Yes.
And when I went back and read it, I was just like, this is kind of a train wreck. I'm probably going to have to just edit this right out of the story.
Because you used some specific word too many times?
Yeah, it started to sound a little obnoxious to where even I was reading it and like, what did I mean here?
What was the point of this? Yeah.
And that's like without having a developed system. But the thing is, when you come up with a hard system like that, a thing to remember is that as you're writing your story, you're going to get used to what all of that means. And so when you go back and read it, you're not going to notice that there's anything wrong. But anyone who reads it who doesn't know your system is going to be like, what the heck is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember that as a creator, you spent a lot more time thinking about it before you started writing than the reader has. And, I mean, Sanderson tries to fix this by kind of having tutorials, and he even has a damn glossary at the back of the book. But, like, it's just... It definitely hurts the flow, and it definitely hurts the literary... I guess you would call it, like, literary dexterity that you could have, because he has to use these same words over and over again. At least he feels that he does. And therefore, there's a lot less room for clever writing or turns of phrase.
Yes, and the constant reference to burning pewter instead of him, he doesn't mix up the terminology to say that he summoned the power of the inherent in the pewter or anything like that. He was constantly saying burning pewter.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's what I mean. It's that he's restricted his vocabulary pretty significantly, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and he had a really good fight scene at one point that was... I mean, it would have been a lot better if it had maybe had a little less of that to distract from the fight scene itself, because I felt it was a solid fight scene overall.
I mean, a lot of his fight scenes are solid, but yeah, there's a lot of that very repetitive vocabulary, and so it becomes hard to... Your eyes kind of wander as you're reading.
Yeah, you start to gloss over things as the reader because you're just like, okay, he's talking about metal again, whatever.
Well, so there was a particular fight in like the first third of the book where I think it's Kelsier fights like 8 people at once.
That's the one I'm thinking of, yeah.
Okay, so I had to read that about 5 times because I got so mired in the push pull, swing, push pull, burn flare stuff that I was like, okay, there's one guy, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I came up to the count of 7 4 separate times before I found the little sentence where the 8th guy went down. And I was like, I like this scene, but like it's very hard to read and like keep track of what's actually happening because so many of the words are the same words.
Yeah, I mean, that didn't bother me too much. Like the confusion of how many people there were he was fighting, that's kind of normal in a lot of writing scenes as long as like...
Well, the thing about it was that the way that he wrote it, he was very careful to be like, this took out one guy, then this took out 2 other guys, then this took out one guy, and blah, 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 blah. And it goes on for 3 or 4 pages. And so I was like, well, wait, you said... Because the first time I read it, I was like, okay, he says 8. And he's been very, very specific about things like this so far. So let's go. Let's count them out. And then I went through the fight and counted 7. I'm like, well, that can't be right. This kid, he can't possibly have made this basic mistake in this part of the book. So I went back and read it again. I'm like, 7. No, it can't be. And I read it again. 7. And I read it again. And finally, on the 5th time through, I was like, oh, there's the 8th guy. Okay, finally. Now I figured it out.
Yeah, I mean, it happens a lot in fight scenes where, like, this is one of the reasons that if I start out with anything specific, I tend to have, like, this vague haze in the center, and then at the end it's like, yep, and everything's kind of all cleared up here, because otherwise, if you have 26 people fighting, you're like, did I get all 26 of them?
Well, like that's fine if you have a brawl, a giant melee, but like if you have one person against 8, the numbers had better work out.
Well, that's the thing, though. That's what I mean, is he did cover all of his bases. It's just that it's easy to miss being clear with one of them if you're doing more than like 3 or 4 at a time. But as long as it's actually there, I guess that's not a big deal, because normally as a reader you're reading over it and it's just like, okay, well, the situation's resolved.
Well, no, because when the way that he wrote it, he also was very careful to point out this took out one guy. This took out. That's why I started counting. Because the first time I was reading it, he's like 8. I'm like, cool, here's a fight scene. And then I started reading it and I see like, this is 1 guy, this is 2 guys, this is 3 guys, this is 4 guys. I'm like, and he was writing that down. I'm like, okay, well, I guess I better keep track. And that's why I started counting, because he was so specific about this move took out one guy. This move took out two guys, kind of thing. I don't know.
He shook hands with the final one and they parted ways.
Right. Well, that was the thing, right? Because, like, I mean, it would have been one thing if it had been like a 4-on-4 fight, because then you could have a focus on one particular pair, or maybe two particular pairs, and then you assume that the other two pairs worked themselves out based on context clues from the end of the fight. Oh yeah, so-and-so is injured, but, he's okay. So-and-so, has to stop and go back because he's, he broke his leg or something. Something like that, right? Like,
yeah, but the perspective is all in one character, so it should,
the perspective in this case was all in one character, so those numbers really should work out. And if they don't, there's a problem. So, yeah, it was just one of those things where, like, he pulled me in. I'm like, cool, okay, this is a 1-on-8 fight. I like this. He's being very specific about when an attack takes somebody down and knocks them out of commission. And then I'm like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Damn it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Damn it. 1, 2, 3. So, I mean, this might have been a particular quirk from my own perspective, but it was one of those things where, like, he had been so specific and careful up to that point that it would have been a shame for him to give up on that at that point,
I mean,
especially so early in the book.
I guess it's just a different reading style, because if I go through a scene like that and I think that and I'm like, wait, I don't remember the 8th one, I usually just like, well, whatever, I'm sure it was taken care of, and I keep going. Like, unless I'm reviewing a book or trying to use a scene to explain something, I don't really.
Well, that was the thing. It pulled me out of the story enough that I was like, no, this should be 8. There really should be. And then I had to go back and I don't know, maybe it was a neurosis on my part, but it did really bother me the first time I read it. And he was so specific. And I was like, 7. Crap.
But getting back to the hard magic versus
sorry about that.
No, that's fine. No, I mean, that scene was full of some goodies that were kind of ruined by the constant reference to burning metals, like
yeah, exactly. Like,
what was the thing that he kept knocking people out with? It was like a paperweight.
It was an ingot or something like that.
Yeah. There was like an ingot he had that he kept pushing and pulling with his metal magic to hit people from behind, because they were these people that were trained to fight magic users, and so they had shields to protect themselves from him. And he, like, I didn't understand, with all this reference to metal and pushing and pulling, there were about a dozen opportunities where he had things that were made of metal that were behind all of these other characters that he should have just been grabbing with his magic and, like, pulling towards him at the incredible speeds that he could apparently do this with. I mean, he had thrown a bunch of coins at them at one point. And so, assumedly, all of these coins are still sitting behind these characters that are now coming at him full force, and he could have just, like, pulled the coins back. He fired them at them with enough force to cut through some of their wooden shields. They were using all wooden implements to fight him because he can control metal. So why didn't he just bring the coins back from the other direction and, like, all right, we'll finish this off real quickly? I didn't understand that part. Just a small pet peeve I had, but fine, whatever.
Well, I mean, this is something that happens with really hard magic systems, is that if you're not careful, like, obvious solutions don't present themselves necessarily when they really kind of should. I don't know. When I was rereading it, and I don't have really a good specific point to make, but I guess when I was rereading it rereading it this week, what I found was that there were places where, like, wait, why didn't he just do this? And there was a few of those, and I don't know. This is one of the downsides of having a very hard system, is that if everyone knows, some significant subset of the rules well, then you as an author have to be especially careful to make sure that everybody, does the things with using the rules as they could, right? Like, if the system were softer, then people could be like, oh, I don't really understand this part that well, and so that's why I didn't do that. Or, oh, I didn't think of that because, there were so many different things I could have thought of to do that one slipped out of my mind, right? Whereas if all you can do is push and pull on metal, then your set of solutions is very narrow, and realistically, you would have a good attention on those specific applications that would give you the end result that you want. If you were the magic user. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think we've discussed kind of the downsides of a hard magic system pretty thoroughly. But do you have anything else to add on that, or?
Other than this has given me a bit of PTSD on the use of the words push and pull in my own stories. Because I was writing something shortly after this where I was describing a character that was trying to take something from an astral plane and put magical pressure on it to kind of push the vision of it into reality. And the minute I wrote the word push, I was like, ugh.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's... You have to be... You have to be careful not to limit your vocabulary. You have to be careful not to overuse words. You have to be careful not to miss obvious solutions to things. You have to be careful not to. I mean, the way that I described it was not. The way that I originally described it to you in private was not particularly positive.
I see no problem with repeating it here. That's up to you. Like, what are we rating this podcast?
Like. How did I put it? Like there are some scenes in the book where you can kind of hear Sanderson doing something untoward with himself while he's writing this.
No, you didn't word it well enough. Let's see. I mean, there's no better way to say it other than it felt like he was getting off every time he was describing how his magic was being used.
Yeah, there you go. It's very self-congratulatory.
I mean... And it just sounded that way. Like, I'm sure that's not actually the case. Like, I have... Yeah. I mean, I have watched a lot of... Okay, I say a lot. I've watched, like, 3 presentations given by Brandon Sanderson that I thought were pretty cool. I do not have any problem with this guy, and I actually kind of liked what I read of the story, and I'm going to finish it.
Yeah, no, I mean, the book is a good book. It's just that there are these issues with it that may have been fixed years ago, for all I know.
Or, alternately, we can just point out that, like... So, hard magic...
Well, we can also point out a lot of the advantages that a hard magic system has, right?
For one thing, a hard magic system is absolutely spectacular if you're designing a video game.
Yes.
So, there's a great use for it. Tabletop game as well. Hard magic can be very fun there, although for a video game it works well because you are putting the player into a place where... you're going to live out an adventure that was created in the mind of someone else. Whereas a tabletop RPG, it doesn't quite work as well because you can have good systems for everything, but you're supposed to leave a lot up to the imagination of the player. So you don't want to like bog them down in these rules that are so specific that they can't have any fun with it. And you've probably I know
I mean, there's the case of like if you have a dungeon master who lets you kind of play fast and loose with the rules for the spells a little bit. Like, oh yeah, that's what this does, but here's what I'm going to try to do with it. And as long as you have a good description of what you're doing, they're like, yeah, I'm going to allow it, right?
Yeah.
And then there are some dungeon masters who are like, no, it does 2d6 damage and that's all, right? And that's where you want to not get bogged down.
No,
that kind of thing.
That's where you don't play with those DMs.
Right. That's what I mean by being bogged down, because most of these games take place over many, many weeks.
Yeah, you do not... Nobody wants a boring DM.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, it's good for video games, but it's also good for, like, plotting, because if Magic can only do a certain subset of things, then you need to worry less about it solving other problems that it's not designed to solve, right? Like, the magic in Mistborn can't, like, turn lead into gold. And so there's no issue, and it can't do anything like turn lead into gold, right? So there's no issue of like, well, why didn't they just turn this into this? Or why didn't they just do this to this? All they can do is, push and pull on stuff. They can, calm or, make angry people, stuff like that. And so by limiting what magic can do, you avoid a lot of questions from readers of like, well, why didn't they just use magic to do X? Or why didn't they just use magic to do Y? And, they used magic to do this thing. And this thing was a big deal. Like, it was a huge deal. And so, like, this is pretty similar to what they could have done here. Why didn't they just use magic to do this again? You can easily write yourself into a, not a corner, but you can write yourself into a self-contradiction that way. If you're using a really soft magic system and you're not careful about what has been done with it and what hasn't been done with it.
Yeah, and, there is a level of suspension of disbelief that you have to have when reading these types of stories, because otherwise you start to ask yourself some very simple questions like, well, wait a minute. if everyone in this world knows that this magic works based on pushing and pulling against metals.
Yeah.
Why do people make things out of metal that are on their houses, especially the nobles who can use the magic themselves? Like, why do they have metal things on their roofs where people can just, like, fly in and invade their homes? Why do they have safes made of metal? Why do they have locks with the mechanisms made of metal that someone can just break from the inside using magic? I was asking these questions a lot as I was reading the break-in scene.
Yeah. Well, like, he tries to go about it by saying that there's this cultural thing that the Mistborn people, they kind of skulk around at night and, they own the night kind of thing. And so they kind of have free reign, but they also, like, are honorable, and therefore they don't do, like, certain, they're not just thieves. They're like actual, like, nobles who, they might have some kind of goal in mind, but generally they're not just going to steal, gold or, whatever. I mean, he tries to put up some cultural ideas to, or some, like, background story stuff that explains it. And he does explain that a lot of the things in the break-in room are not made of metal, and therefore, Kelsier can't use them in the scene. But, like, yeah, there's a lot of, and all the people have these wooden staffs to fight with instead of swords or whatever. A lot of stuff like that. But, like, yeah, there are still questions that need to be asked.
Well, I mean, that's all fine. That's kind of what I meant it more as this is how you have to read this story than a criticism of the story, because you're going to find stuff that doesn't make sense in just about anything you read. And you're not going to find a ton of it in a good story, but right. There's always something. Someone can always nitpick something out of even the best of stories. The thing is...
Well, I mean, it's perfectly valid for the author to have stuff inside his head that he doesn't write down. Like, or like for... what's a good example of this? Like, it's not necessary for the author to write out every detail of how a person picks a lock. All we need to know is that they were or weren't able to pick the lock, right? And that can go either way. But, like, we don't need to know what kind of tumblers there are necessarily, unless the author is particularly enamored with the science and technique of lockpicking. But, like, and there can be character motivations that don't show up necessarily. There can be characters who never have POV, who never have, the narrator speaking about their thoughts, but they still do things. So, you have to kind of assume that they have those internal monologues, but you're not privy to them, which is fine.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make is just that these stories, it's not that there's all these problems with them, it's that this is where, to an extent, you should allow a little suspension of disbelief. Like, there's not really any reason to overthink that, okay, so someone has a bit of metal on their roof. They should be thinking about this if they know they live in this kind of world. But
yeah,
it's when it gets to be too much. Like that level of disbelief was fine with me. I could read that story without having too much of a problem with that. The rest of what was happening was fun enough, minus the repetition of burn, push, pull, loot, murder, pillage, whatever.
Yeah.
I didn't mind too much of the questions it raised, other than this fight should have been over in 5 seconds.
Yeah.
The coin thing was the thing where it's like, okay, that's about the limit of my suspension of disbelief. Like, he just threw those coins. He knows they're there.
Well, it's not just that he knows that they're there, right? The magic system itself describes that whenever there's a piece of metal within the range of their operation, that they see a line coming from their chest to the metal. And so he knows that those are all there, especially because he is currently using the magic.
He invades that nobleman's house from much further away, right, by detecting the metal on the roof.
Exactly.
So, I think that's enough dogging Brandon Sanderson.
Well, we're not really dogging him, but
I know.
I
but
mean,
it's important.
It's an interesting idea. The idea of this super hard magic system. And of course, the other thing to note is that until you finish the book, you don't know the whole system, because the way that he operates basically is that he tells you most of the system, and then the rest of it becomes clear at the very end. So
yeah, like
that's
he
another
didn't get
thing
into
that you have to do.
He didn't get into the 11th medal or the 10th one on what it actually did up to where I read, so I know there was more to it that I hadn't seen.
Yeah. No, but there's more. There's even more to the system than that, and it becomes kind of a balancing act to what parts you're going to tell the reader and what parts you're not. I think it's done pretty well in that book. You get kind of a very satisfying ending, but like at the same time, you wonder why. Like, if the system of the 8 common metals, if the system of the 8 common metals was that well known and that systematized, it's surprising that other parts of it weren't also systematized somehow by someone. Because that kind of systematization takes a lot of like work, and especially in a world where the scientific method doesn't really exist anymore because the people have been impoverished so badly and the nobles have become so decadent that there's not really, you know what I mean? Like there's a little something fishy there to me, just in the overall feel of the setting, because like.
Well, yeah, there's also the case of Vin, who had these powers and didn't even understand anything about them. Like, she hadn't had any experience hearing about them anywhere either. But yet she seemed to know, she seemed to have heard of mistings and mistborns and other things, and it was just like, well, what level of knowledge is present in the average person about this stuff? Because it seems like a lot of people knew things about it, but it also seemed like they didn't know very specific things about how any of it worked.
Yeah, I mean, the introduction of the main characters who are very, very knowledgeable about all the different kinds of magic uses of the common 8 metals is a big deal, because it requires, not requires, but it kind of like precipitates those rules to the reader at that point, which is fine. But like now it means that you need to be especially secretive about any remaining rules to keep any mystery in the story at all.
Yeah, so some other so like I was saying with there is oh my god, I can't remember if I talked about this when we were recording or before we were recording. Did I bring up the genre thing while we were recording?
Maybe?
Yeah, I think
maybe
I did. I think I did. So there's a genre of fiction called lit RPG.
You brought up lit RPGs, but I don't think you made the genre comment.
Yeah, so
you said the Netflix thing, but like, yeah, you didn't say the thing that you said earlier about genre meaning generalization. Therefore,
yeah, genre is there to say this is a general area of fiction or something, and we got into this weird area with streaming where you would log on to Netflix and they would have these very specific things that they were calling genres, and so you'd see action adventure, horror, mystery, and then the next one would be people who like pillows, and it's just like, what does that mean? Why is that a genre? And I remember a joke about this from long, long ago where someone had a discussion about a genre of anime being called Pretty Boys in Armor.
Oh yeah.
I'm sure you remember that. But that was like years ago. We were laughing so hard at that, and now it's just gotten so out of control that Pretty Boy in Armor seems like a pretty tame name for a genre.
It's actually pretty descriptive of like a large quantity of stuff.
Well, it's much more descriptive than what you get nowadays. Like, I can't even remember some of the stuff I used to see on Netflix because I don't have a Netflix subscription anymore. But it's
all algorithmic is the thing, right? Netflix. There's no person at Netflix that's like classifying these things as X or Y. It's that you watched a video or a series that had this characteristic in it. It was about dogs. And so there's some kind of tag database, and a bunch of other series are tagged with the tag dog. And so people who like dogs, or people who liked this show that you watched that was about dogs, like these. So that's one of the downsides of having like an algorithmic method for choosing recommendations, is that it loses kind of that human aspect of it, where it's basically like, you liked tag, here is other things with tag, as opposed to like someone saying, hey, you liked Dawn of the Dead, have you ever the 1978 version. And have you seen Day of the Dead? Stuff like that.
It is so much worse than that, though. Because let's take your idea with dogs. Here's what really happens. Like you gave the bare bones description of it, but here's what really happens. You watch a documentary about someone who left an estate to their dog. And the next thing you know, you pop onto Netflix, and all of a sudden, there's an entire genre that's just like other dog landowners you might be interested in. And and then you look at it, and there's 20 of these. Is that really this big of a genre? And then you start to realize in your head, as the madness unfolds, you start to think to yourself, "Oh my God, 3 of these were real," and people watched them enough to where someone said, "Oh, according to my Netflix algorithm, there's money to be made here. I should make a documentary about wealthy dog landowners." And the next thing you know, there's 30 of them. It's just this feedback loop that...
Oof, yeah, you're right.
that like completely decimates the entertainment industry.
I would call it a positive feedback loop, but I don't want to call it a positive feedback loop.
It operates like a positive feedback loop, but
I know, but
it operates like a positive feedback loop, but all the sluices are filled with garbage.
Yes.
But okay, so we should probably talk about the lit RPG just a little bit. Like,
yeah, go for it.
I haven't read a full lit RPG novel, and the reason for this is because they're the most obnoxious fiction I've ever read in my life. It was bad enough when...
Well, so a little bit of background. There's something going on currently in like the Japanese novel and media landscape called like the Isekai boom, and it's kind of gone from being a boom to like a glut. And so what Isekai means is that a person died or something happened to them in the real world, and they end up in like a fantasy world or a science fiction world of some sort. And so there was this massive wave of these books that came out in the last decade or so, and probably starting in like the late 2000s.
It's about 2010 is when it really, really started to pick up.
Yeah, it ramped up, and now there's so much of this material being churned out on a daily basis that it's actually kind of scary.
I actually want to talk about this a bit in depth before we really, really get on the whole lit RPG thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's just because I happen to have...
And let's be clear, some of this stuff is really good. It follows the what do you call it? The principle, the 80-20 principle. That like 20% of it is actually good, and 80% of it is, common garbage. It might be more like a 90-10 principle.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe there's like 80-20 where like 20 is where there's potential for good, but then there's another 80-20 in that 20%, and the 20 is the good stuff.
The actually good stuff.
Because I've seen really good ideas that just fell apart completely when they were put into practice.
There's a lot of that where the author just doesn't know what to do with it, and they have this really cool idea, and then they don't develop it properly, and it just kind of flounders. Yeah, definitely. But
there's so isekai just means another world. That's the literal translation of isekai. Yes. And it's there's some really, really good fiction that did come out of this. Like, if you haven't read Saga of Tanya the Evil, what are you doing with your life? Get out there, get it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's published in English. Go find it. You'll love it.
Yeah.
But these stories became really popular, and part of the reason that many people assume they became popular, and I think this is the correct reason, is that Japan became a depressingly lonely place, especially for younger men in society. And one of the reasons for this is that it became very, very important in one's livelihood in Japan that you get to the top of your class, fiercely competitive high school, and you make good grades. You get into a college you want.
Because it's even worse than that. Because the competition to get, because they don't have compulsory high school, and so you have to compete to get into high school to then compete to be the best in high school.
Yeah. It's all competition, and obviously in a competition, not everyone can win, which makes it a very bleak outlook for a lot of people who are
for the majority.
Yeah,
for the majority.
The majority of people can't win. You have winners and losers. You have a you have a marathon and one person is going to be at the front, and
Right.
there's going to be a lot of people at the end.
Well, there might even be 10 people that are close to the front, but the problem is that the fact that 20 people all finished the marathon within the same say 2 minutes doesn't necessarily translate to you saying, "Oh, I won 19th place in that marathon," you know?
And this may sound like a good thing to people who are like, well, I mean, meritocracy, right? But the problem with that is that you have an entire labor force that could be getting things done. And just like here in America, where they've filtered out people who could be doing good jobs and helping make progress by requiring them to have a 4-year degree that most of them can't afford,
Right.
in Japan, you have a similar thing with this filtering process of, all right, well, these are the people that are going to be able to get into college and get these good careers, and these are the people that, no matter how good they are at something, they have to do this, which is why you have such a booming entertainment industry in Japan, because sometimes that's all that's left, and sometimes it's just like, if I don't make it here, there's nowhere else. And there's a ton of entertainment in Japan. Bread and circuses is in full flare there.
Yeah.
So you end up with this situation where a lot of people do not have the self-esteem to really pursue things, especially things like relationships, and the numbers can speak to this in Japan, where a lot of people just don't bother with relationships, and there's a lot of single men, and a lot of them go on to become salarymen, and then those are the people that are, they're basically working themselves into a grave for the companies they work for, because they really don't have much choice.
Yeah.
Which is why after work drinking is such a big thing, because these are the people that you're going to be seeing the most, and then after work you all go out and drink together, including a lot of times your section chiefs. So
there's a lot of obligation there.
Yeah, there's also an obligation to do so. Like you can't just be the guy that, like, I don't drink. Like, I don't want to go to a bar and drink with all my coworkers. But like in Japan, it's like, I mean, you have to. You don't really get a choice.
Yeah, you have to. Yes.
It's part of the job, and you're not getting paid for that part.
And it ruins people's familial relationships too.
Yeah, I mean, divorce rates are high. People's families break up all the time over salarymen working too many hours. And it's really dinged the population growth there. I mean, Japan is looking at a 1.2 children to each parent rate, which is,
I don't know what the number is, but it's bad, and it's way below replacement.
Yeah, it's not getting any better. So you have there's a major depression and loneliness and self-esteem problem in Japan, and a lot of people feel like this isekai thing kind of came out of that, because it originally started as these stories about someone who dies and wakes up in another world, and this other world is just full of, like, most of the time it's full of a new opportunity for them to explore. Or sometimes they get one very specific thing that they're forced into, but it's completely different.
What happens a lot is that they find that they excel at something for once in their existence.
Yeah, like something that they might have been good at in the real world, but weren't given the opportunity for. Now they're in this other world where they can actually pursue that, and right. That's, a lot of people think that that's just like this is like the voice of a whole generation speaking out about how they can't really. They don't really have much freedom to pursue the things they might be good at. And this sort of played into the whole escapism theme, where what happened is people started playing MMOs. They were playing these massively multiplayer online games where they could sit at home. They didn't have to go out and make friends. They could sit at a computer, log into a game, meet people online, and then these people became the friends that they regularly hung out with. Like, they'd come home from work, log in, and they'd talk to the same people they were talking to the night before and the night before, and this became a lot of people's social world. So what this isekai genre slowly started shifting into these stories about people who died and woke up in their game world, where they had already excelled at things in that world, so they were more prepared to be a sentient creature in this world than other players and the computer characters. And this is where lit RPGs started to really find a foothold, because you started to get people that would write these stories where they would explain to you these MMO game rules, and they would talk about, like they're trapped in this world, and the character that's trapped in the world actually has a display that can pop up in front of them where they can make menu selections like they're actually in the game. It's not just them being placed in this fantasy world. They're constricted to the rules of this game, which makes it a hard magic genre, depending on which one you're reading. A lot of them forewent, even if they were there were several that said, yeah, you're in the game world now, but they kind of glossed over the game rules and just made it a fantasy story.
Or like they're in a world that mimics the fantasy world but has some specific, some vague and not really well described differences, kind of thing. Yeah. There's a spectrum here.
Yeah, there's a wide variety of these stories.
But there's a focus on I used my skill X that does, between 3 and 65 damage, and something like that. It's very numerical, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah, and if you've played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, or if you've known people that have, there are people who get really into the numbers and just like really into how each system works. And so a lot of those people who were either playing these games and were experts at it, or who had played tabletop games and were experts at it, started writing stories very similar to isekais, where they're talking about the actual numbers and rules behind these entire battle systems, let alone magic systems. Like we're talking like swinging a sword has these timing elements, and there are books that get so into detail with the role-playing game side of rules and descriptions of how things work that it's considered a genre now. It's called literary RPGs. They call them lit RPGs. I can assure you most of them are not lit. I would occasionally try picking up one at the local Barnes and Noble and read through, and it was just like rule after rule after rule, and this is why this character is able to do this, and this is why this character is able to do this, and it's just like, oh my god, this is a bestseller. What's going on here?
Yeah, I keep seeing them pop up on my Bookwalker feed. I'm like, what's this lit RPG genre? And then I looked at it, I'm like, oh.
It's largely a Japanese thing for the time being, but there have been several English authors that have done it. They're mostly independent authors. I can't think of any. I don't think there's any mainstream authors that write lit RPG, but
no.
It's a big genre with a lot to filter through, and it suffers from there being enough bad that nobody wants to wade through to find the good. And yet I feel like there's enough readership for the bad that doesn't matter, because it seems like it's a popular genre.
Yeah, people will get into this particular genre and they'll just get engrossed in... there's, I don't know, there's people who love figuring out tricks and ways to exploit rule systems. And I think that these lit RPG books have a lot of appeal for them specifically. But the thing about it is that, like, if we're trying to connect this to the earlier theme that you were talking about of, like, depression and isolation, or even merit, the person who in these games knows the rules knows the best ways to do many things. And therefore, this gives a person who the thing that they do best is figure out these games and figure out the rules. It gives them a way to excel where there wasn't even like a real world example of how they would have excelled otherwise. Well, I'm really good at creating high DPS builds in this game. Now becomes your thing that your character does in the books to become the excellent character.
And this kind of shows through in so there was a show called Log Horizon.
Yes.
It was an anime that featured a guy who had specialized in playing support characters in a video game, and then all of a sudden all the people that played this game were sucked into the game world, and since he was the only person who was really an expert with the support rules, he ended up, even though he was using a character that wasn't considered a very powerful character from the game rule standards. He was so good at it, he was able to confuse a lot of things in battle to work to his advantage. And this is often how these stories go, where one person will be so good at understanding the rules of what's essentially a hard magic setting that they will be able to defeat their enemies, not with power, but with their understanding of the system itself.
Yeah.
This, again, like this was probably very likely the result of this whole aspect of people trying to, live out their own fantasies in a world where it was just, they didn't see much opportunity for that. And another, there were good things that came of this too. Like, there's not too many people who are going to argue at this point that Japanese comic books have just trounced the Western comics in terms of sales and likability and fan bases. And one of the big reasons for that is, even in parts of the world where this major depression that seems to be a haze in Japan right now, just like blanketing the Japanese people, a lot of these stories tend to be uplifting, with a lot of stories about friends helping each other and people working together to accomplish a goal. Because I'm sure that Japan isn't much different here, where a lot of people that you work with are generally out for themselves and they just want to get through their workday and go home. And, it's like you might identify a problem that could have been worked out if, everyone had gotten together, but it's just like nobody cares, do they? And you find yourself all alone trying to fix these things. But then you go home and you pick up a copy of your favorite Japanese manga and you read a few chapters and you're like, oh, here's 5 friends that solved a pretty simple problem just by working together. And it's got a bit of charm, and they're usually pretty heartwarming moments, so it appeals to a lot of people who don't see a lot of that in the world.
Right. No, I think that's a good point, too. I mean, like, there's a lot of, I guess you could call it, like, wish fulfillment or wish fulfillment by proxy.
Yeah.
Seeing the things that people... Because we all get told the same garbage in school, where it's like, oh, you can be whatever you want, you can work together and achieve anything, yada, yada, yada. And then you get to the real world, and it's not like that most of the time. Sometimes it is, but very rarely.
It is very rare that people work together in such a friendly fashion as to seek out to accomplish one goal. Like, I had seen so many times growing up where I heard about these people that work together and accomplish these amazing things, and then you actually learn about them later on. It's like almost every single one of them had some falling out, and then like say you remember an old cartoon and you're like, oh, why did they stop doing that? And it's like, oh, everyone argued and nobody wanted to fulfill the vision of it. It's like, yeah, okay, and you can understand to some extent why that happens. I mean, everyone's got a different feeling about how much money they should be making or what they actually want to do with their lives, and some people just don't want to work on the project anymore. But you do spend a significant amount of time being young and hearing about doing these things and accomplishing these things with other people, only to find that is just not how it pans out. And that is severely the case in Japan.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like, you leave the unidealized world for a more idealized version of it, and that has its appeal to some people. There's the escapism element of it too, where like you get out of, a lot of people feel like, crushed or throttled by like modern, say like the amount of politics that gets into things. People see that and they get disgusted, and so they they find something that doesn't have those petty conflicts, but has a more concrete conflict that's more meaningful and more real, I guess, even though it's in fiction, right? Like, instead of bickering over 35% marginal tax rate to 39% marginal tax rate, you have people, fighting, against some kind of, evil force that's trying to take over the world or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, let's say hypothetically there was someone who, they see a lot of injustice everywhere. They never really see anyone being held to account, and then they try to enjoy the occasional movie that's supposed to feature a hero or a superhero, and the heroes are kind of always presented as washed out, and they're in some gray area rather than looking at things in terms of good and evil, and sometimes they're utterly humiliated by the end of the movie, and you're just like you're just clawing for something that will make you feel good about things, and then it's like, all right, screw it, I'm just going to write a story about someone that slaughters all of the bad people and the good people win. And I could see someone doing that.
Yeah, well, it's been done.
Let's just say that someone somewhere probably feels the need to show actual justice being done somewhere.
So
what about soft magic? Because we...
Well, so, like, I mean, we're all kind of familiar with soft magic, right? It's like the where you don't really know what it can do. It's Lord of the Rings is a pretty good example of a fairly soft magic system. I don't think Tolkien ever wrote down... I mean, Tolkien might have had rules in his head, but I don't think he ever wrote them down, and he's dead now. So, like, we have what we have in the books. But if you think about it from this perspective, like, if you look at the Silmarillion or something like that, all of that stuff is like divinity, not magic, but divinity. And the idea behind divinity is that it's kind of not omnipotent, but like selectively omnipotent, right? And so, like, you have the what are they called in the Silmarillion? I forget what they're called, but they're like the demigods or not quite demigods, but like the lesser gods in Tolkien's mythology. And they all have certain abilities, but they also have very human aspects. But there's not really any like, oh, he can do, he's really good with yo-yos or something like that, right? Like there's nothing specific about what their magic can do.
Yeah.
Because it's not designed to be specific. It's designed to be kind of vague. And the problem with a soft magic system is that you end up with lots of questions, like why didn't they use the eagles to do X in Lord of the Rings or stuff like that. Right? Like if you have a series of books where different people show that they can do a certain set of acts with magic, you start to find similarities between certain situations and the situations where they used their magic abilities to solve problems. And so, like the problem with soft magic often enough is that people forget what their magic can do, and therefore they create a problem for their characters that could be solved with magic, but then they don't solve it with magic. Or the alternative end of this is that magic becomes a deus ex machina that just solves every problem that is presented as insoluble. So, there are lots of problems with soft magic, that it can be vague, it can be too foggy, it can leave readers like unfulfilled, like, well, why doesn't this work? Or why can't you do this? Or this seems similar. It leads to a lot of questions in the reader, and you have to be very good at making magic like subtle and not like like if you think about Lord of the Rings, magic solves very few problems directly. It does a few things here and there, but not much. And that's how Tolkien had to write it, because otherwise he would have gotten tangled up in, well, magic does this, and magic does this, and magic does this, and magic does this, and it becomes the solution to every problem. Whereas that's not what that's not what he wanted to do with that world. So,
yeah, there's people who have done pretty decent jobs with soft magic. Like I can think.
Oh yeah,
Robert
absolutely.
Asprin,
it can be done very well.
Robert Asprin was definitely one with his myth books. I always thought the Xanth novels did a pretty decent job with soft magic, because the soft magic in the Xanth novels, they tended to have very simple rules. So there were actually rules to how things worked, but the whole point of those novels was that Piers Anthony would use his magic system to create what's a good way to put it? He would use the very rules of each person's ability to create ways that they could like trick the system. Depending, because each person had a skill that was their own personal magic. The original story was about a character who thought he had no magic, and he was going to fight a powerful magician who was going to take over the world. And when they finally faced off, sorry, spoilers for you, but these books were written like 40 years ago, so deal with it.
King Kong dies at the end.
Yeah, King Kong dies at the end, and the magician realizes that that this guy actually does have a magic ability, and his ability is that he is so incredibly lucky that he basically can't be defeated. So like just before this magician is going to try and kill this character, he realizes, if I do this, it'll backfire on me and I'll be the one to die. This guy should be king, not me. And he actually ends up becoming more of a good guy character, and or like a mentor basically to everyone else. He goes back to live in his palace as like the wise person of the world, and he gives the kingship to this character. I think his name was Bink. Good name for a lead character who becomes king. But but it's like he had all these different characters each with a different ability and a different rule about how they could use their powers. And this one guy who looked like he had no power ended up having more power than anyone else.
Right.
And all of his stories are like that. Because then after that, the second book, I believe, is about Bink actually destroying all the magic in the world, and then all these people that were once magic users have to figure out how to bring it back or something.
They have to get real jobs.
Yeah, they have to get real jobs. And then the third book, I believe, is Bink's son going on some quest. There's it's a bunch of different characters, each that had a unique skill that ended up being the focal point of how can I mess with these rules from the perspective of the author.
Yeah.
They're pretty fun books. Robert Asprin, I only read a couple of his books, and it's been so long that I don't really remember everything that happened, but I do remember that the way that he played with magic was kind of fun in those stories.
Yeah. With a slightly softer system, you can play around with it a little bit more. That's one of the advantages too.
Yeah, but maybe let's talk about ways that you can use soft magic in, like, if you're going to write soft magic, what's a good way to do it? Do you have anything for that?
Well, I haven't written a lot of fantasy, but I am working on a fantasy like world. And the one thing I'm using soft magic for is I'm using soft magic for the creation story, kind of like in the Silmarillion, where these gods got together to to basically create the world, and they have power, but it's kind of nondescript power. But because they're not characters with like agency or like human characteristics to a certain degree, they use the power for certain things, and then the power goes away because they've used it up, something like that. Miracles are a good example of soft magic, by definition, right? So any kind of like priestly magic, going back into like the Dungeons and Dragons kind of motif, like these things have fewer rules because they're working from a power that has because they're borrowing power from a source rather than being the source themselves, right? It puts distance between the characters and the magic if you're working like it that way. I mean, to make a reference, that I think I'm sure you'll enjoy, like the explanation that Lena has about magic, about black magic in Slayers, right? She doesn't have the power herself; she's borrowing it from someone else, and therefore what she can do is limited by what that source would allow her to do.
Yeah, and actually, I'm surprised I didn't think of giving that as an example of a fun soft magic story.
Well, that's why I brought it up. I'm grateful that you left some crumbs for me to bring up.
Crumbs? I think you.
I know.
Haven't you tackled half of our conversation?
Yeah, no. I haven't covered much of the anime related stuff. So like, for me to get that Slayers reference in is like.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's like.
Yeah, I don't leave too many of the anime crumbs for you. I'm.
Especially Slayers.
Yeah. It's rare that I leave that one out. It's one of my failings as Weeb Force 1, is I tend to be the one to bring up the anime.
Fair enough.
No, that was a nickname I gave myself at work. We were talking about stuff at work, and I was talking about anime with a guy that I work with who listens to a lot of Japanese music but doesn't actually watch a lot of anime. But
right.
Whenever you get talking about that stuff, you start to
go on.
You start to think in terms of like the past, where like everyone you're sitting around talking about Japanese stuff with, it's like, oh yeah, of course they know anime. And so I would just tell him about anime stuff, and then I'd have to stop myself and be like, oh right, you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, do you? And he's like, no.
No, I don't.
And so I told him, yeah, I'm basically Weeb Force 1. I know a lot about anime. I talk about anime too much.
Well, we have we have an entire episode that we did before we started this podcast. We were doing kind of like podcast style episodes on YouTube where we basically just reminisce about like the good old days.
Yeah, like the Fansub
anime,
days,
the Fansub golden age and stuff like that, which I can link to. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot of that stuff going on. Soft magic systems. The problem, one of the problems with soft magic systems is that they leave a lot of questions in the eyes of the reader, and you as an author have to be careful to anticipate those questions and try to answer at least some of them, because the more questions the reader has rolling around in his head about how much sense this magic system makes, in the first place, the less suspension of disbelief he'll have for other parts of your story. And so therefore, he needs to feel, your reader needs to feel like he understands kind of what the limits of magic are, but not really. It also gives you, occasional outs and stuff like that to say, oh, well, this is something that this particular character learned how to do and nobody else could figure out. You can do that in hard magic systems, but the harder the magic system is, the easier it is to systematize it. And if it's systematized, then hypothetically, anybody can be taught that system, or at least understand it, right? Maybe they can't use magic, but they at least understand that you push on X and pull on Y. Whereas if the system is kind of vague, then it makes sense for a lot of people not to understand, like, what exactly is going on or where exactly it has applications. The double edge of that, of course, is that so I used to play Dungeons and Dragons with a group, and the DM was like, this whole world doesn't make sense. You realize that, right? I'm like, well, explain why. He's like, look, here's a magician. Here's a spell. This guy can cast this spell, 3 times per day. And, there's no reason why the entire world isn't completely dominated by a few very skilled magicians based on the spells that just exist in Dungeons and Dragons, right? There's no reason why that wouldn't be the case. And yet here we are in a world that doesn't seem to be dominated that way, and it doesn't make any sense. But that was his argument, at least. So, I mean, you have to be careful not to make it a Deus Ex Machina, which is a really easy thing to do. It's just like, oh, he solved it with magic. He solved this problem with magic. Then he solved this problem with magic, and eventually every problem gets solved at one time or another with magic.
What you can do. Okay, so if we're going to talk technique,
yeah.
So just I'll get one thing out of the way really quickly. You can actually design a hard magic system by starting with a story where you're using soft magic and developing the rules with each encounter that requires magic as you go along. And if you write enough of that, you'll eventually have a system that you have built these rules into place with. But
well, yes and no. You'll either have a system.
Well, it depends on how well you craft
diligent
it.
you are.
Yeah,
you have to be very diligent about it, because if you're not careful, then what you end up is not a series of rules that make sense. You end up with a series of rules that are full of self-contradictions, and that's even worse.
Yeah, well, you don't do that. You avoid doing that.
Well, I mean,
the point is this is one way that you can do it.
Way easier said than done. Yeah.
You can also write your moments in which magic is used in a way that gives a little piece of information about what happened each time it happens, so that you give the illusion of having this hard magic system without in your own head actually having any set of rules whatsoever. One of the things I do, so I have this character that I use for the occasional short story who found a magical book, and when she found it, something happened to where her best friend died and now follows her around as a ghost. And this ghost will give her information that can often be vital in her surviving, because ever since she touched this book, she's being chased by ghosts. And so she has this one ghost ally that's helping her evade these ghosts. But the book itself contains magic that she can use. Now, I was totally slick about it. I basically said, yeah, I basically presented it as she doesn't understand the magic in the book, but she can use it. And somehow when she tries to use it, the book sort of lets her know
her
how
out.
to use it
Yeah.
and what to do. But what you can do so that it doesn't always seem like it's a deus ex machina, even when it is at times, but what you can do
Mm-hmm.
is you can present the character with problems that arise from using the magic. And so in the case of this
Sure.
story, she has this ever-creeping scar that every time she uses magic is crawling up her arm towards her neck and up her face, and she has no idea what's going to happen when it covers her body.
Right.
And not only that, but you can also present situations where the magic doesn't quite work the way that she would like it to.
Yeah, that's another good trick. Yeah.
Yeah, and instead it presents her with a different way of solving a problem, or presents her with another problem itself.
Or it doesn't solve the problem and requires her to now deal with this more difficult problem.
Yeah.
Without it. Yeah.
And doing things
So
like...
So let me just stop you for a second there. This unpredictable aspect is something that you can't really have in a hard magic system.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could work it in somehow. You could make some kind of, quantum mechanical kind of hand wavy thing about, half the time the magic does what you want, and half the time it does the opposite. It's like, well, then why would anyone bother with this?
Well, no, this is not okay. So that's part of what makes it work, though, is she's also always in desperate situations in which she practically has to use the book.
Right.
So like that.
It becomes a last resort and not a multi-tool.
Yeah.
Right?
So she's in a situation where often these spirits are so vile and so powerful that she has no choice but to use the book. But she also knows that the book is doing something to her that she doesn't understand. And she also knows that she doesn't necessarily know what the effects of the book are. So that in itself, just those three things, create a hard system in which it's like the illusion of a really in-depth system, but really there's just these couple of basic rules, kind of like a Death Note. Like there's...
Yeah.
Death Note created a really sensible set of rules in which they were able to create a mystery story using what is essentially magic, because the rules that the book had to follow. And
it's not just that the rules had to follow the books, but the rules were... So here's the thing. The larger your set of rules, the more likely it is that something will contradict something else. And so it becomes a really important thing to do to pare down your rules to as many... To as few and as, carefully defined as possible. And you can deliberately leave a couple of loopholes here and there. But in general, there weren't 400 different rules for using the Death Note. There were like 10, right? So the more if you keep it simple, it becomes easier to make it work. But the more complicated, but you're always there's an encouragement to make it more complicated because it's like, ooh, it'll be cooler if it's more complicated. But at the same time, you run the risk of slamming yourself into a wall that way.
Well, actually, Death Note is a really good example of how to give the illusion of having a hard magic system. It's a soft magic system. The hard magic part of it is that everyone is approaching dealing with this magic logically, and logic is as hard a magic as you can get. It's already a fully developed system, and everything has to make sense in logic. Nobody has to come up with the rules for this themselves. The rules exist. And by using logic for these people to try and determine how murders are being committed with magic, they have essentially taken a soft magic story and placed a hard magic element in it. And this is another trick you can use. This is also the trick that they use in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which, I mean, there are a couple examples of books that I can give that aren't things that aren't anime that do this, but these are really two really good examples of in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, you have a group of people that have acquired strange abilities somehow. And these abilities tend to have a myriad of uses that are discovered throughout the story. They're always presented early on as, oh, this is what it can do. But as the story progresses, what you're seeing is the characters are coming up with very clever ways of using those abilities to thwart their enemies. And this is largely if you want to take the easy route in doing hard magic, create soft magic and then add logic to it. All of the characters are acting very logically with these few rules that they have for their powers. Rather than sitting down and developing the D20 rolls for everything that you are doing, which is what you would do if you wanted to write a lit RPG.
Yeah.
You can instead tell these incredible stories that anyone can understand just by using logic as your hard magic system.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And it's a great way to... It's actually something that will help writing action scenes, too. Whether you're using magic or not in an action scene, if everything has a logical flow, and if the solution to a fight is a logical thing, you'll leave the readers satisfied with, you'll leave them feeling like you're more clever than you actually are, basically.
Well, at the very least, at the end of the story, they'll say, that made sense.
Yeah, which is... It's always satisfying to read something that makes sense, even if it's not as good as a story that's just wildly off the walls with everything. But, 9 times out of 10, the thing that makes sense is usually the better thing.
Yeah, I can say that. I can buy that. That makes sense to me. I mean, it's like... It's fundamentally unsatisfying to read something that you're like, oh, I like the way that the author wrote this, but at the same time, I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah, and, I keep going back to Sherlock Holmes as an example for... He's never been my favorite detective character, but the character is definitely beloved for a good reason, and essentially Sherlock Holmes books are a hard magic book. He has a very logical system which he uses to solve mysteries. And anyone in this world...
He also has knowledge that nobody else has.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the magical
That's the magic part.
It.
But everything about his magic has rules that he has to follow. And in doing so, obviously this isn't hard magic in the sense of Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn.
No, I get what you're doing. You're kind of drawing a comparison, and I think it's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, and these are just things to think about. It's like nobody that I'm aware of, I don't know how many other authors do this, but I don't think too many people sit down with the intention of, I'm going to write hard magic or soft magic. I think that people just...
that's where I think you're wrong, because I was poking around in the writing forums that we were both working using recently, and there was a forum thing specifically about this, and it was fairly... I wouldn't say it was contentious, but there was a lot of oh yeah, I want to make this a hard magic system. I want to make this a hard magic system. I want to make this a hard magic system. There was a lot of that kind of sentiment going through that thread, and it was actually very surprising to me, because it showed how much of an effect the introduction of actual hard magic had on fantasy writing in general.
Well, I suppose
part of it is because Sanderson made hard magic popular, right? There's if he hadn't ever made hard magic popular and advocated for it as powerfully as he does, then maybe it wouldn't have happened. But this does seem to be a trend in current fiction, current fantasy fiction, because people are trying to deliberately create rule sets for themselves, which is part of why I wanted to talk about this topic.
Well, my honest opinion on it is that I think it takes it a step too far. From where I stood, every time I wrote a story that used fantastic science or some kind of magic, I always wanted it to make sense. I wanted everything that happened to make sense. And I always strive to make sure that whatever I'm doing with either magic or science in my stories, up to the point that it's science fiction, it makes sense. Because I don't really write hard science, so I couldn't it make perfect quantum sense. But it to me, that is a solid foundation for having magic systems that work. If the reader can read it and say, okay, I can understand why magic was used here, why the characters did this with it, and the author clearly explained what this magic is doing, even if I don't know how the magic works, then you've created a good system in which people can have a bit of fun with, and which you can use your imagination to come up with new scenarios.
Right. That's kind of my point, though, is that that's what a lot of people who are writing hard magic seem to forget, is that and they instead focus on the rules and not the imagination, the fun of it.
Well, it sounds to me like when you say that Brandon Sanderson advocates for it, it kind of sounds to me like there's this faction that thinks that only writing hard magic is valid. And
I don't know if anyone would necessarily go that far.
well,
But
I don't know about that, but it really makes it sound like well, this is like not necessarily Brandon Sanderson, but just the impression that you gave that there's a lot of people in writing forums that want to turn it into hard magic. I almost get the feeling that there's like there's almost certainly an element to some group of people that's just like, this is the only legitimate way to do magic. And
I mean,
I don't.
those people may exist, but I've never dealt with them personally, so I don't know.
Okay, well, I mean, I haven't been on writing forums in a while now, so I used to be on them all the time, and I would go on and like I would look at things other people were writing. I would look at what I would try to give help to people that were like, well, how do I do this? And
Yeah.
I would just kind of hang around and see what's going on. I barely ever use them to really get any criticism of my own stuff or anything, even though I probably should have. But I just kept running into too many people that, like, the majority of people who are calling themselves writers on writers forums started to turn into people who would spend an entire year talking about how they want to start writing. Like, I could understand if they were talking about, oh, I'm writing something or I'm in the middle of it, but I would see a lot of people, both people that had been there a while and people that were new and were coming in like, I really want to write something, and then they never wrote anything, and I was just like, what am I doing here?
Yeah. I haven't had that experience yet, but I mean, I guess I haven't looked too widely. I'm this is one of those things that is just a common part of the human condition, is that people want to have something be right when they start it, rather than just starting it and getting something done and seeing how it turns out.
That's actually something Terry Pratchett once said. He said he had often found that most people that talked about how they wanted to be a writer, what they actually wanted was to have written. So,
yes.
So they kind of skip an important step there. But I haven't been around there much, so I haven't really seen any of the people talking about hard magic systems. But I do not think it is either valid. I don't think it's invalid at all to write either hard magic or soft magic or a mix of the two, or
sure.
Just as far as I'm concerned, if you can write something, write it well and write it in a way in which the reader will enjoy it and understand it and get to use their imagination. I don't see a problem with any of them.
I think that what we've done here is I think we've laid down a foundation of what are the pitfalls of both systems and what are the advantages that they have, so that people who are listening to this hopefully will say, oh, these jerks over at the Wordy Pair, they were like, don't use the same words for everything in your hard magic system, and like, oh, I'm using the same words for everything in my hard magic system. I better fix that. If I can make one paragraph of someone's story a little more interesting by having them use words other than push and pull, I think we've done our job.
And also, just because there's a lot of vagueness to writing. So another thing to remember is that if you can write something that sounds fun and reasonable, that uses a lot of repetition in words, go for it. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that in the vast amount of reading I have done in my life, I don't think I've ever really seen anyone do that and do it well.
Well,
but if you are capable of doing that, like if you think you have something where it's repetitive and it uses a lot of repeat words and someone can sit down and enjoy it, then don't take this as hard advice. You absolutely
if you can manage
can't
it somehow, but like at the same time, I think that there's a pretty solid body of evidence that says that just for the purposes of thinking about the average reader or the average set of readers, if they read something that's very repetitive, that in itself is going to affect their ability to, pay attention to it, to understand it, to wish to continue to read it. I mean, let's not mince words here. Like, if you try to write a novel using only 100 words in the English language, you could maybe do it, but it's probably not going to be very good.
Just remember that writing itself is not a hard science. There are rules that you should follow, such as make the story fun and enjoyable, be creative, but in general, there's no specific piece of advice like, no, you absolutely can't do this. There's like common sense rules, like don't write a book in all caps. I think that there may be one situation in the universe in which that might make for entertaining reading, but by God, just just don't do that.
Right. Well, I mean,
try to use punctuation so that people can understand your sentences.
It has to be understandable. Is the thing, right? Like the more avant-garde you get with your writing techniques, the more people you're going to leave behind who are like, I don't understand what this is doing, and I don't want to read it anymore. You know, like if you want to be the next E.E. Cummings, go ahead and be the next E.E. Cummings. But like, I don't think anyone is ever going to read a novel-length version of anything that E.E. Cummings ever thought about writing.
And always remember that if your goal is to write something that you want other people to read and enjoy, you have to be writing for the reader. You can be writing for yourself, but if your goal isn't just for you to sit back and reread something you wrote by yourself in a lonely room over and over and over again, keep the reader in mind. Like I referenced earlier how someone may or may not have written a story because they were angry at injustice and they wanted to see some justice done. I was talking about a story I wrote, and I specifically said that I wrote it for myself, but I didn't actually write that one for myself. I want other people to read it and be like, yeah, there were bad things going on here, and they deserved what happened to them for the most part.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind when you're writing. Like if you want to write a science fiction story where, you know, someone will look at it with the same sense of awe that you have when it's like, oh, that would be really cool if that happened, or if this kind of world existed and this kind of technology existed and you could do these things with it and you could have an adventure like this with it. Try to get that across to the reader. That's your goal. That is what you really want if you want other people to read and enjoy your stuff.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's the you know, it's not how you value your story, it's how other people value your story if you're intending it as something to be sold as writing. So you have to produce what the market wants, what some subset of the market wants is probably a better way to put that.
Yeah, but, to some degree. Like in my instance, I have definitely written more for myself than readers because I am not good at marketing. So,
yeah.
So
well, like it's a thing that. So you're a really good example because you are also a reader, and so you know what people you've read a lot of things, and therefore you have a kind of an intuition or intuitive idea of what has sold in the past, and so then you can kind of tailor that intuition towards what direction your own writing goes. That this is, you know, I think we might be getting into the too obvious weeds, but. I don't know.
Well, you'd be amazed how many people never took this basic advice to heart when they were asking me for advice. Like there would be people that would just be in shock, like for the simplest thing, like, oh, I never thought about it that way. Like, yeah, I guess I'm not really writing this so that someone else can enjoy it. I'm just writing what's in my head.
Right.
Because there is a difference between just jotting down what's in your head and writing a story. Like you have a tale that you want to tell to someone else. If you didn't, then you wouldn't be putting it on paper.
Because it's already in your head.
Yeah, you don't have to put it in writing if it's solely for you. You can do that. I mean, I do go back and read my own stuff, which surprises me every time because I really thought I wouldn't care about it after I'd finished it. But essentially, once you take it out of your head and put it down somewhere, unless you are the most soulless being imaginable, or unless it's like a diary with your deepest, darkest secrets that you just want there to be able to kind of look at and be like, wow, I'm a horrible person on occasion. You have written it down for a reason. You've written it down for posterity because somewhere at some time you would like someone else to see it. There's definitely a level of narcissism or ego that one has to have to put something in writing. Isn't there a Nero Wolfe quote for that? What did Nero Wolfe say about that?
Nothing corrupts a man so deeply as writing a book.
Yes, that was it. and there's a lot that can be read into that, but we can save that for our Nero Wolfe discussion.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I don't know. Is there any last minute advice we can give about hard or soft magic? Like, I don't think I would be good to give advice on writing hard magic. I could definitely give advice on writing soft magic. I don't.
I mean, you know, I think that the general guidelines of keep it simple and for hard magic, keep it simple, keep it not repetitive, and for soft magic, you need to. It can't be a Deus Ex Machina, and it can't it has to have some kind of limits, but like those limits don't need to be hard limits, but you can introduce limits in other ways, just as you were talking about earlier in the episode. So.
Oh, yeah, I'll give another example of that real quick. So
sure.
I actually do write a lot of things where it looks like there's just a Deus Ex Machina in operation. And one of the ways I deal with that is I have a massive cast of superhero characters that I occasionally use for my stories. And each one of them has a unique ability that they can use. But their ability is often their weakness. With a few exceptions that I did for comedy, such as I had one character that could manifest these pillow-like creations that she could use to defend herself or attack her enemies, but they seriously only had like the effect of a pillow. So really good defensive ability, really bad offensive.
And now we understand why Netflix is serving you things about people who like pillows.
Oh, good God. Netflix never saw that though, but no, I don't describe them as.
You don't know that.
I don't describe them very much as pillow-like in the stories. I actually came up with a goofy name for it just because this whole character was supposed to be kind of a comedic character. I had based her off of Amelia from the Slayers, and she could summon this substance that was called Floozle that existed in everything, but she was the only person in the entire universe that knew about it or could manipulate it. Yeah. And it's basically this invincible barrier that is just a soft cushion. So it might be a barrier, but it can also be pushed against. I hate that word now. God.
Yeah, I know, right?
I know, it's bothering me every time I say the word push or pull now.
See, this is the reaction that you want to avoid eliciting in your readers.
Yeah.
You want to avoid creating a visceral distaste for any particular word in the mind of your reader. Because if you've done that, then you've done damage, not entertainment.
Yeah, so this ability of hers, like I said, every character has to have a weakness. Her weakness has nothing to do with her ability. She's one of the only characters that this is true for in the entire story. But at the same moment, it's like, what the heck is Floozle? Nobody knows what a Floozle is, whatever. Her weakness is ice cream, but she's also very, very addicted to ice cream. So if she uses ice cream, she can't use her powers. Other than that, she's considered one of the most powerful characters in the story. But if she eats ice cream, it just completely nullifies all of her abilities.
So this reminds me of a line that you brought in an earlier episode, also on the YouTube channel. We were talking about. Oh God! It was Batman versus Superman, I think, and our home is our poison.
Yeah, our ice cream is our poison.
Our ice cream is our poison. Yeah,
it wasn't Batman versus Superman. The line "their home is their poison" was from Smallville. Yeah.
But we were talking about Smallville in the context of Batman versus Superman.
Yeah.
Anyway,
but like for the rest of these characters, so I have one character whose ability is that she is always stronger than her opponent. So the obvious way to defeat her was to present her with an opponent that was so weak that she couldn't hold up her own body when she fought him. So I had this character that was essentially a toddler, and he was so weak that she couldn't support her own body with her strength because she could only be slightly more powerful than her opponent, no matter who it was. Right. And so she lost that fight.
And so he was lighter and weaker, and she couldn't hold her arm up because she didn't have enough strength. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was another character who is like, he's the Superman of the story. He's essentially invincible. He's considered the most powerful person in the world. And everyone kind of looks up to him as the hero that, anyone can really respect. I mean, basically this kind of carbon copy of Superman, up to a point. But his weakness, and this is one of my favorite ones ever, his weakness is that while he's completely invincible and he's incredibly powerful, and he has all these different abilities, he only has a regular person's ability to deal with anything he does. So, like, he feels pain at a regular person's level. So if he punches through a brick wall, he feels all that.
Right.
He doesn't just feel like, ow, I punched a wall. He feels like, what if you punched a wall with the strength of Superman and had to feel all of that pain on impact? And so he's called the crybaby superhero.
I see. Okay.
But it's things like that I use to weaken enemies.
Or like you can have someone who has the power to turn into a motorcycle, but painfully.
Yeah. That was one of the best creations ever. He can morph into a motorcycle, but it hurts him to do so. He feels his body turning into metal.
All of his bones breaking and reforming.
Now that we're having fun with it, I'm going to go on and list a few others, because I actually like... I think I've got some pretty funny ones. Okay, so I had one... I do Superman a lot. The Superman one is my favorite one to play around with. Like
Yeah.
the girl that's always more powerful than her opponents, that was kind of a Superman one.
Sure.
I have another one. It's this girl that's... She's basically as powerful as the Superman character.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And she's actually more invincible. Like, she doesn't feel the pain or anything like he does. Her problem is that she reached a certain age and her body is invincible and unstoppable because her cells are basically stuck in stasis. She can't be changed in any way, which means her brain is also stuck at one stage. And and here there's like a bit of a logical fallacy here, because she can learn new things and she has like a normal functioning brain. The problem is that her body can't change enough to where it can solve any mental problems she has. And she is severely depressed and upset with things, and she can't cure that. So that's her weakness.
Right. Crippling depression.
Yeah, crippling depression is literally her weakness. And it's even better because her character's name is Susan Sider, so her hero name is Suicide. Now, the funny thing about that is her name is not Suicide because she's depressed and can't kill herself, but because she can do things like, say, launch herself. So she's a character that can't fly. However, she has the ability to swim through the ether of space, so if she's in space, she can essentially fly. But if she's in orbit, she just falls to the earth.
Okay.
So her strongest point is that she can just jump up into the air and let herself free fall with enough impact to basically be a bomb.
Right.
I had a character named Phoenix Boy who he can kind of control fire and he can fly because he has, bird wings. Well, he can't control fire, but he can like kind of summon fire. The problem is he's really unstable internally, so he'll often explode and then he's reborn from his own ashes.
Right,
but there'll be problems where like other heroes won't want to work with him because occasionally he'll hiccup and explode.
Right.
So I do a lot of fun things like that just to take these overpowered characters. Like I presented like 3 characters there that are essentially unkillable, but all of them have these completely crippling it wasn't just that their power is their weakness. Their level of power tends to be their level of weakness. So if they are incredibly powerful, they have an incredible weakness as well.
Yeah.
And that's one method that I use to deal with, having things that are too overpowered in stories.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough.
Nothing beats the guy turning into a motorcycle painfully, though. That is top tier gold right there.
And those were fun days.
Then I'll have silly weaknesses too, like I have a guy who's he's called Beatty the Iron Boy, and his body is solid iron, and his weakness is essentially that he can't really go upstairs because he's too heavy. It's just like a stupid weakness like that.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the advantages of having a more fantastic, world as opposed to something that's very grounded.
Yeah.
Because you can create when you have a world where goofy things that don't make like physical sense happen a lot, you can play around with that a lot more as opposed to like really hard sci-fi where it's not really even like there's no fantasy aspect to it at all. There's maybe some futurism, like, I could see that this technology could do this maybe in 100 years kind of thing. But like, you don't have people doing super things, which, to be honest, it's more exciting to have a little bit of fantasy in there. So
yeah, I've always been more of I've always enjoyed writing more fantastic pieces than down to earth stories.
But you'll never write the great American novel.
Thank God. Never read one I liked.
Well, so I just watched that clip from The Simpsons, where Principal Skinner is saying he wants to write the great American novel, and he describes Jurassic Park, but calls it Billy and the Clonosaurus. So
I forgot about that one.
Classic Simpsons.
Oh, it's just...
But yeah. Go ahead.
No, I don't know. I'm still thinking of fun counterbalances that I've written. I kind of got off on a tangent there, but I just have so much fun with it. That's what you have to do.
I mean, that's the point, though, is that when you're having fun, probably your reader is having fun too. So that's another aspect of it.
Yeah, and you
Whereas
can...
if and I mean having fun, like having fun in the gleeful sense, and not having fun in the enjoying yourself when you say the words push and pull sense.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people probably take issue with the idea of a character that's caught in a terminal depression, but I mean, you have to be mirthful sometimes. You have to... Okay, so my essential writing style, if you're to boil it down to the basics, I like fairy tales, and I write fairy tales. Even when I'm writing science fiction or my weird, fantastic, violent action stories, I am essentially writing a fairy tale.
Yeah.
And fairy tales are not happy little fun romps in the woods that necessarily have happy endings. I mean, I like happy endings as long as it's not some boilerplate and they rode off into the sunset and lived happily ever after. That doesn't appeal to me. But I like happy endings, like, oh, this is the culmination of this character's growth, and the world that they started in that wasn't all that great, they ended up leaving off a better place, and now they've gotten some semblance of happiness out of their journey. Like they're a new person because of it.
Or even if they're not a new person, they've had positive influences somewhere.
Yes, but fairy tales have always had an element of darkness to them. And a lot of them ended very darkly as well. I mean, there's a lot of things that Disney did with fairy tales that were not the real endings of these stories.
Oh no, yeah. So it's interesting that like fairy tales used to be cautionary tales for children.
Yeah.
Right? And at some point they evolved from cautionary tales about potential dangers to feel-good tales about happy endings and
being able to do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but like, what's a good example of a fairy tale that has, shifted over the years? Like, isn't the original version of Hansel and Gretel like they both die?
Well, I know that I think the original version was them throwing the witch in the oven. I don't think they both died in the original, but I don't remember because that story has been told so many times in so many different ways.
I remember that there was a fairy tale that very distinctly changed from everybody died from Hamlet to like to something uplifting where everyone doesn't die at the end. I can't remember what it was. I'd have to think about it. I don't have it prepared.
Let's see. There's Snow White and Briar Rose. There's The Brave Little Tailor. There's...
I mean, I don't know enough about fairy tales to... There was just this one example that I had read about a long time ago.
No, you're right. There are examples of ones that ended very darkly, and for as many of them as I've read, I mean, I'm sure I've got like a collection here somewhere that has a bunch of them. I'm struggling to remember the ones that ended really, really badly. It's like right on the tip of my tongue.
I mean, we can make an episode about it at some point. We can go read a bunch of Grimms and come back and be like, ooh, that one has changed over the years. Yeah. People got more protective of children, and so like you can't be like, if you do this, you're gonna die, because that just became not acceptable.
Yeah,
possibly for good reasons.
And if you're one of those people who hasn't delved into this kind of writing before, stop what you're doing. Put your writing on the back burner. Go read some Grimm's fairy tales. And I'm not going to say that you have to read anything to be a writer, but I'm going to go ahead and say Grimm's fairy tales. Just consider it essential reading if you really want a good grasp of a short form way that a tale should operate from start to finish.
Short form fantasy, short form moral play kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, so I guess I should go read some Grimms.
Like, I don't remember the stepsisters in Cinderella having their eyes pecked out with crows in the Disney version. Let's just say that.
No, that is not. Well, like, yeah, there a lot of the retributive. Is that a word? A lot of the retribution aspects of things got tempered over time as well, because like, well, they just. They saw the error of their ways rather than being eaten by crows, which, it works better for the MPAA.
if we're going to try and invent a word for that, can we call it reputatorial?
Well, no, because I'm trying to use the word retribution.
Yeah.
Not reputation.
I'm sorry, I meant retributorial. What did I say?
You said repubitorial.
Yeah, okay,
I was
sorry.
confused.
Retributorial is what I meant.
But anyway, like, I think retributive is a word, but I'd have to go look it up. It's not a common one. But anyway.
I think it's read as retributive, though.
Is it? No, it might be. I would not be surprised if it was.
I need to buy why don't I have... I need a giant dictionary. I miss having a dictionary that has the pronunciation in the footnotes.
So I have an unabridged dictionary, and it has been incredibly useful a few times, but most of the time I just use the online ones.
But I have to buy an old one because Merriam-Webster's been dicking around with definitions again. So
well, I mean, the thing is that when you have an unabridged dictionary, the percentage of stuff that has been dicked around with is like 0.00001.
This is true. I guess it doesn't matter. But I mean, it might be an important word sometime. Like a word that pops into my head that's like, okay, wait, do I actually know the full meaning of this? And then I look it up and it's like, no, that doesn't seem to be the real meaning. What happened here?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and then I have to tear pages out of the dictionary like Nero Wolfe did and throw them into the fire.
I mean, there's definitely a lot of old dictionaries that you could find some old unabridged dictionaries on eBay or in a used bookstore. And
there's a lot of them at antique bookstores. I just need to pick one up one day.
It's not a bad idea, honestly. I'm thinking about it myself, actually.
I can get one of them podiums that I can keep it on at all times.
All right. Well, I think that is probably pretty good for an episode.
No, not yet. Not yet.
No, not yet. Not yet. What do you?
I had one more character that I thought was funny that I wanted to mention.
Let's do it.
He's a character called Malady who has the ability to make people feel sick, but he also has to feel just as sick as he makes them feel.
Oh no. Can he make multiple people feel sick, and then it stacks on him?
No, it's just one person at a time.
Oh, okay.
I'm pretty sure that I defined that when I created him, but I'm... Actually, now you've got me second-guessing a character I created. I'm pretty sure that I made that a rule.
That he can only do it to one person at a time?
But if I didn't, then the rule would either be that it would all stack on him, or he could only distribute it, like say like one person would be half and another would be half, but he would feel 100% of that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it would have to go that way.
And so if he tried to do it to a lot of people, it would have diminishing returns. Like he's being violently ill and they've just got the sniffles.
Yeah. Well, like, I'm imagining someone like, oh man, I may have eaten too much on my last meal. And like there's like 20 people that are like that, and meanwhile he's like violently retching into a toilet somewhere.
Yeah, no, well, okay, so the reason that I wanted to bring him up is because I've mentioned before that I just love torturing my characters. Yeah. And he's one of the characters, he's kind of like on and off a bad guy or a good guy. He kind of just joins people to help them get things done. And so he'll be on a mission with someone and they'll be like, all right, you're up. And he's like, oh boy, here we go. It's like, he tends to be like in a heist or something, his job will be to make someone feel so sick that they have to run off somewhere. And he's just like, I don't want to do this.
Why did I sign up for this?
Yeah, it's
awesome.
Oh God, it's don't be afraid. Okay, so don't be afraid to torture your characters. Be someone willing to write a dark fairy tale if you think you can entertain your readers with that, because you can't just have these bland characters that are all goody little two shoes and the villains don't have any motivation. They're just like, I'm evil because being evil is good.
Well, like, there's a lot... Okay, so I think that's not really the problem these days. Like, there's way too many people that are hyper-focused on being dark and gritty. And while your characters have, like, flaws and weaknesses, and they are miserable sometimes, like, being miserable isn't the general state of the world in general and stuff that you write. There might be something trying to cause misery, but generally there's something opposing the thing causing misery as well. So, like, yeah, there's something to be learned there, too.
Yeah, I mean, dark and gritty has its place, but you have to know how to use any style that you're going to write in, you have to know how to use it. If you're going to write hard magic, you've got to be able to bring the reader into that. If you're going to write soft magic, same. If you're going to write superhero stories, you have to... The reader has to get a sense that, you know, if someone's reading a superhero story and they're like, this person isn't a hero, what have you done wrong? You've done a lot wrong.
Yeah.
Because it's not a superhero story if your character isn't heroic. If there's no
Right.
heroism in the story, you're not writing a superhero story. You're being a blathering idiot. And that
You're deconstructing a heroism story and turning it into something less interesting.
and it's not a hero story at all if you do that.
Right.
You
Right.
have to understand what it is you're writing. If you can't even understand what it is you're writing, your readers aren't going to understand why you presented it to them. This is a major problem in a lot of works that are coming out of all sorts of media these days.
No, good point, yeah.
It's one of the reasons that, I don't know, I mean, you could...
It's one of the reasons why the Netflix sticker is like a scarlet letter.
Yeah, like the Hugo Award.
The Scarlet N.
The black spot. Okay, now I think we can safely say that we're finished.
All right. That has been, or rather, this has been episode 11 of the Wordy Pair. We are talking hard and soft magic this time. I'm Rudy.
And I'm Justin.
And we are out. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Wordy Pair Podcast. Our passion is all things writing, world building, and getting into the weird and wonderful world of fiction. We hope you enjoyed our unique takes. If you did, make sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to get your weekly dose of writing weirdness. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hit us up on Twitter. For Rudy, it's @Rudolph_Cone. And for Justin, @Ninja Mouse Chew. See you next time on the Wordy Pair Podcast.